Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and hope that this will be a useful session. There's some very interesting things to talk about as regards culture. Let me move on to the first point, and that's that we've all become sort of mini experts in a sense on culture. The affordable ability to travel, at least up until COVID, gave us a much greater sense of where we were as a culture and how we relate to others. And I think that's really been extremely helpful. The issue is that as we develop more and more, we see that actually there's a degree of complexity around culture. So I like to view it as essentially like an onion, that in a sense you constantly absorb knowledge, experience and learning, and you see new things. And as you unpack cultural differences and cultural assimilation, you see a lot more and you learn. I mean, I've been living now in Asia for almost 9 years, and I'm still constantly learning little intricacies. I mean, I'll give you one example. In the West, we very often point with our finger. That's considered to be extremely rude in most of Asia. So people point with their thumb like that. So it's actually very hard to see which way they're pointing. When I first came, I found it amazingly amusing. Now, I'd been to Asia so many times up until actually coming to live here, and I never noticed it. So it was a real sense of things do develop the longer and the more you assimilate. So cultural intelligence, and it's really about dealing with the differences and the ambiguity. And things are ambiguous when you start working, when you start negotiating, when you start living in a different cultural environment. Things are not as what you might seem, even though often it is. And although the world has become very westernized, cultural differences still remain and are still very strongly held. So as we have IQ and EQ, there's this whole notion of having cultural intelligence, actually working across cultures, recognizing and valuing cultural differences, and then respecting them. And that brings that all together to essentially to produce cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence has a number of drivers. You'll see strategy, so your awareness to plan for multicultural interactions. You need to have an open mindset. Going with a fixed mindset, it'll be the same. It just won't. Your knowledge, how you understand and how you actually see things as similar and different. Nothing wrong with seeing differences or similarities, but actually it really helps you navigate this map. And how can you work in different cultural and multicultural contexts? And all that brings together this sort of mixture of culture, which is really, really fascinating. And it's never ending and surprising, at least it has been for me. So I'll give you some examples of where it's not quite worked right. And if you're like me, you'll be very surprised by a couple of examples I'm going to go through. So Colgate introduced a new toothpaste in France. This is admittedly in the late 70s, and it was called Q. And so, you know, it had fluoride and whatever, and was launched into that market. And you'll know that multinationals spend a long time before they launch new products into markets. Unfortunately, Q happened to be also the name of a porno magazine in France, and a well-known porno magazine. So not surprisingly, Q didn't do as well as it might. The other example, Pepsi. And it's interesting because the mantra was come alive with the Pepsi generation. So of course you'll see the 2 tins of Pepsi here on the screen, and you'll see the translation. But unfortunately, when it was translated into Mandarin Chinese, it came out as Pepsi brings back your ancestors back from the grave. So you'd think surely Pepsi would know this when they were launching a new product. Not surprisingly, the local market didn't respond terribly well to drinking their ancestors' grave parts or something. So you'd thought, okay, well, surely other companies can do better. What about Coca-Cola? Well, Coca-Cola actually did not much better. That translated into bite, the wax tadpole, or female horse stuffed with wax, depending on the particular dialect. Some of these are so amusing, you'd think that surely companies would get this right. Ultimately, then Koch researched over 40,000 Chinese characters and used a phonetic of Coca-Cola, basically which meant happiness in the mouth. But of course, getting these things right, simple things like that, is incredibly important. So really, this is an honor to be presenting this work on culture. And of course, Gert Hofstede is really the preeminent scholar in this, and sadly he passed away earlier this year in February at the age of 92. And he really started in the late 70s, early 80s, the whole thinking about understanding different cultures. So there are four elements of this. One is power distance. So power distance is really your acceptability of how power is distributed in society and whether it's equal or unequal. So in the West, you have a boss, but you don't think you're necessarily unequal to him or her. But actually in high power distance cultures, Asia in particular, Malaysia where I live, has actually the highest power distance relationship between boss and subordinate that there is. So bosses are revered. When I talk to colleagues, often they address me as doctor or professor. They find it very difficult to use my first name. And I'm not talking about young people, I'm talking about people who are also senior. So the use of titles is very important to them to actually show that distance. So it's repetitive in that sense. The other, which is I think more obvious, is individualism and collectivism. And this is really whether the tie between individuals is loose or it's very strong. So in the US, Australia, the UK, we're very individualistic in our views. We can see that as something like the wearing of masks and COVID, where people have an opinion of whether they should or shouldn't. In a more collectivist environment, Mexico, Asia, in general, people go with the flow. You know, if they're told by the governments to do something like wear a mask, they do. We've been wearing a mask since March the 17th. I haven't gone out without a mask since March of this year. I think not wearing a mask would look strange. Compare that to, of course, Sweden, where people are not wearing masks at all. And if you go to Sweden and wear a mask, people look at you rather strangely. The other element is masculinity and femininity. And it's not quite male and female, but it really is about the social gender roles and whether they're clearly distinct. So male values are very much around power and wealth. And you see that in Austria, Japan, Italy. But femininity is really what you see in Scandinavia, where social gender overlaps considerably, the Netherlands, for example. And then the final element is uncertainty avoidance. And that's really how you feel as regards threatened by certain or unknown situations. And COVID is a perfect example. So low uncertainty avoidance is Jamaica and Denmark and the Scandinavian, where rules are flexible. And then high uncertainty avoidance would be much more organized, rule-orientated, like Greece, Portugal, and Japan. So it gave people a vocabulary for the first time. And Gert Hofstede's work has been phenomenal in helping us sort of undo and achieve that. So there are some results, actually, interestingly enough, for different countries. And you see, and if you just highlight the UK, power distance in the UK is low, which is what you'd expect. You sort of respect your boss, but you wouldn't do it exactly as your boss said in case you needed to for whatever reason. Individuality, 89, is very high, again, is what you'd expect from an individualistic society. Masculine, feminine, well, we're sort of a bit in the middle. People have particular roles, but there's much more flexibility. And of course, uncertainty avoidance is low. I mean, we're used to dealing with different scenarios and different situations. So then this brings us on really to the main theme of today's talk, and really about how the different values. And Charles Hampden Turner, who is a companion of the Institute, and who's on the left, and Fons Trompenaars, who's on the right on the screen, have done some seminal work on looking at culture. And it's the way people solve problems. So Hofstadter was very much about behavioral activities. What Fons and Charles have done is really look at this from a way people solve problems. And they see the view that values are differences or dilemmas that can be reconciled. So let me give you an example. For a simple example, I want to reduce my costs, but I want to increase profit. So how do you do that? How do you work that through in a different? And actually what you find is that in order to understand them, you look at the extremes, and that is an extreme, and then you find what is a scenario or a dilemma reconciliation in their vocabulary that in a sense helps you. So the work of Fons and Charles has been phenomenal. And Fons is interesting. He's Dutch. His mother is French. His father is Dutch. So as he always says, he learned from a very early age about different cross-cultural environments. And the Dutch are interesting because Hofstadter was Dutch, Fons is Dutch. You have some very good and very interesting, strong Anglo-Dutch companies like Shell and Unilever, who, although the Dutch and the British are very different, you'll see that actually they work incredibly well together. So actually there can be real hand and glove arrangements with different cultures that is really quite powerful. So the work of Fons and Charles is really around universalism versus particularism, individualism versus communalism, and we'll come on to talk about that in the next slide, and that will give you a sense of where things fit. It's similar in some ways to Hofstadter, but it goes an extra step and looks really at the reconciling differences around problems. So let's have a look at this. So you've got universalism and particularism, and that's really how rules apply. Do rules apply in all situations, or are they different? So rules are followed in the UK and the US and Canada, but actually rules may be much more flexible in different parts of the world, Asia in particular. So it's really the ability to tolerate that, and you can see the continuum that you have from that. I mean, the US is probably the prime example of universalism in the sense that you can remove the President of the United States through impeachment. That's very hard to do in many other cultures and other countries. Then we move on to individualism and collectivism. I think it's pretty obvious, and this is really about essentially whether you act as an individual or whether you're part of the greater group, whether it's the society, the family, the firm. And you see people will act very differently. So individualism is fine for entrepreneurs, it works really well. In Asia, collectivism is really paramount. It's very important. You are loyal to the company. Your personal loyalty is a lot less. Then we have neutral or effective, and that's really about emotion and whether you show emotions externally. So neutral would be very much actually in Asia and about the notion of saving face. Effective is very much a Western concept where we feel quite comfortable in expressing our feelings. And I'm always often slightly amused when I pass through airports and you're in Asia and you see somebody not from Asia, largely from the West, arguing or shouting at people at the airport because either they've lost their bag or the flight has been delayed. Interestingly, the response from Asians is to just literally cut off. They find it very difficult to respond to someone who's basically over emotional. They just literally blank it out, and they'll often walk away because it's for them something that they're just not used to dealing with. Achievement and ascription, and that's really similar to Hofstadter's power distance. Do I gain success from what I achieve, or is it described? And this is really about egalitarian on achievement. So, for example, promotions would be very much order and systematic. The description would be based on who you know, what you know, and whether you've been in a role a particular long time. So you get promoted over time rather than essentially competence. Specific and diffuse, well, that's really interesting because, you know, do you like things linked or are they diffuse, and probably the best way is to sort of see how you actually interpret information. Do you go straight to the point, which say the Dutch would be, and very direct, or do you go around the story, which we Brits seem to do, you know, very much around, you know, I've got your piece of work, it looks very interesting, I enjoyed reading it, I think it would benefit from some changes that could bring out more about the details, that rather than say actually that you don't particularly like it. Sequential and synchronic really is about different events and how you juggle that. And what's interesting is time flexibility. When I used to teach in Europe, and I teach Germans, French, Italians, and Spanish and Brits in a class, I always knew when the class was about to come to end, because 10 minutes before the class, the Germans would start to slowly, quietly pack up their things, and literally by the end point of the class, they'd be ready with their bags packed to leave. And if you kept them over the time, they would get slightly agitated. So you'd have to warn them that, you know, we're overrun if we are, or whatever. So it is useful to know these essentially cultural norms, because it allows you to be much more flexible and to juggle those differences. And then finally, inner directed or outer directed. I mean, that's again about, do we control our environment or does it control us? And the environment is very much controlled, it's outer directed in somewhere like in Asia. But in the US, the UK and Canada and Australia, we are largely destined to use that ourselves. We decide on what we want to do. Again, wearing a mask during COVID is a perfect example. So these are the seven dimensions that Fons and Charles have put together under the Trompenaz, Hamden, Turner methodology, and it's been incredibly useful. They've collected significant data from over 50 countries, and it's very rich in a sense of what it can offer, particularly when it comes to dilemma reconciliation. So let's give us an example. So here we are, different cultures, different values, and here it is, what happens to your friend? So let's just read this together. You're riding in a car driven by a close friend who hits a pedestrian. You know your friend was driving at least 45 miles per hour in an area of the city where the maximum is only 30 miles. Your friend's lawyers say that if you testify under oath that your friend's speed was only 30 miles, it may save your friend from serious consequences. And there are no other witnesses. So the question is, does your friend have a definite right as a friend to expect you to testify to the lower figure? What would you do? You've probably already decided. Let me give you the results from different countries around the world. So who would not lie for their friend? Well, if you're Swiss or in Switzerland, you've got no hope and chance. And as you see, the UK, over 91%, 90% would not lie for their friend. And that's very much the norm in an Anglo-Saxon Western cultural environment. As you go down the table, you see Spain, which is in Europe, France, again, where it's not quite so clear cut, and you come down to China and Russia. And it's very interesting when you talk to people in countries like China, Russia, the role of the friend is very important. So why would you not lie for them, is their construct. While if you talk to somebody in the US or Switzerland or even the UK, they will say quite clearly, you must be joking. Why would I lie when they've done something technically wrong? So very interesting how it plays out. And that richness is very much around the differences in culture. So cultural stereotypes, we've all got them. You know, I just gave you one of the Germans always being on time, the Italians talking too much, or whatever cultural view you might have. So are they valuable? Well, to a certain extent, when they reduce some uncertainty. So I know if I'm teaching German students how I should behave, so it really helps me. but not if you use it as it's an individual stereotype that's not positive. And I think that's the difference. We become frightened to say that Germans are timely, that Japanese trains all work to not only to the minute, but to the seconds. It's quite amazing if you travel in Japan, how on time the trains are. It's something I always used to think we could learn greatly from in the UK. So final thoughts on managing cross-culture and managing a team. I think communication is incredibly important, using a variety of communications methods, checking that your message is understood. Don't forget a yes could even be a maybe, particularly in a high power distance scenario. When I used to say, let's brainstorm ideas, what do you think about what we want to do for the future? How do we bring about change? People would say, well, what do you think, boss? Tell us what you think first. You know, the notion that you'll get grassroots is very hard and actually takes a lot of time and patience, particularly in a nation context, to bring about those views. They are there, you can get them, but they take time. The thing I've learned, and you might see I quite enjoy food, is that eating is incredibly important in Asia. Don't underestimate the power of a meal. And it's not drinks. Drinks would be considered to be very much secondary. And in fact, the question is, if you offered somebody a drink or a coffee or whatever, they'd probably say, why are we not going out for dinner? Surely you want to strengthen that relationship. And the other most important thing is you don't talk about work. Remember FACE, we talked about this already, giving people the opportunity to walk away without feeling bad. That's very important when it comes to business. So the notion of what's happening in China and the US at the moment is very interesting. You've got Donald Trump who wants to negotiate a deal with China, but he's not giving any sense of face to the Chinese. So he wants to do a deal, and then the next day he puts a negative tweet out about the Chinese or whatever he wants to say. The Chinese just don't understand that. Why would you insult the people that you're already talking to? So I think that notion of face and different cultural differences really plays out significantly. Finally, be patient and be open to learning. There's a lot to learn, and it's a phenomenal and interesting journey. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much. Sheshe, Chimakasi, Shukriya. And I'm hoping, and I can see Kate has appeared, that we'll be able to take some questions.
Yes, here I am, and thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. We've already had some comments for people saying where can they find out more. Well, there is a handout today, and I think that's got some of the information that the Institute provides. If you're a member, please do look at our dimension map with all the resources that go with it. And there's the books, particularly I'd endorse Raymond's recommendation of Charles Hampden Turner and Fons Trompenaars. It's very accessible, I think, full of examples. I like that. Now, here's a question, Raymond, about coaching, and this is something really interesting what you're saying about power distance, etc. Somebody says, I've been asked to prepare a proposal to introduce coaching across an international multilingual project. Any advice for that? I mean, is coaching accepted internationally as a starting point?
Well, I think multinationals have been using coaching for some time, but interestingly enough, it's trickling down, and I do coaching here in Malaysia and in this region. So it is gaining traction. There are two observations I would make. One is that don't think that everybody in Asia is an introvert just because they're quiet, and they are in a sense controlled in their emotions, as we've already discussed. They have views, sometimes strong views, and so the notion of coaching is the ability to get them to share those views and think those through. I think what I found being a Westerner coaching, and I suppose it's different if you're an Asian coaching an Asian, is often they will say, well, okay, you're a Westerner, you tell us what you think. So that is still a very strong preference for people here. And you have to fight against that. You have to really say, well, you know, let's explore this together, because it is really not about being told how it should be done in the West, There's often the belief that actually doing things in the West is better than Asia, which obviously is not the case. So yes, by all means, go for coaching. I think it's growing in prominence, and it's great fun.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, somebody's concerned here about cross-cultural teams when you don't see them, though I imagine for many multinationals that's the norm. So how do you, and I think this would perhaps help also with the coaching question, how do you change, or do you change your communication style in order to, because you're not all in the same room?
I think it's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge even in a national context of how you engage people, and also don't forget that people's language capabilities can be quite different. And I remember when I was part of a team and we were in Europe, and we had a colleague who was in Australia, and my boss at the time said to me, you know, David is very relaxed when he's on these calls. I mean, you know, he's sort of saying he was watching telly and having a beer, which, you know, was considered to be sort of slightly socially unacceptable. But it was because it was 11:30 at night. We were in a different time zone. So people will behave very, very differently. And I think you've got to factor that in. Also, strong power distance you will need to make an effort to getting out there, to having that conversation. And also to ensure that people who are strong in society or family are listened to, because that's very important to them. I mean, this is work, but essentially the family and society also plays a role for them.
So here's a question. I think it's talking about, maybe it's referring to how you address people. It says if you're leading a team of individuals who are from different cultural backgrounds, how do you address them? And how are you more accommodating?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, and it's a very real situation. So when I first moved to this region, I said, I gave people the option. I said, either call me Raymond or call me Dr. Raymond. It's entirely up to you. And I remember my CFO at the time used to call me Dr. Raymond, and you know, she was of my sort of age, and we were, you know, we got on very well. And I said to her, why don't you just call me Raymond? And she was really taken aback, and she said, oh, okay, I'll call you sir. So it defeated the whole object. For certain people in certain cultural environments, they prefer that delineation between people. It just happens to be the case. And so if people want to call you by first names or nicknames, that's fine. And I always say, how would you like me to address you? You know, that's the easiest way. And you can address me as, and give people a range of names. And I think that then helps people fit, okay, I prefer to do it that way.
Yeah, I think we've got a final comment here. Somebody's saying, well, you didn't expand on checking that people understand the fact that language and concept is impacted significantly by culture and cultural differences. So there are so many levels at which we're communicating with people, and this particular attendee is absolutely fascinated by them. As I think, to be honest, Raymond, so am I, and so are you. This is just something you never know enough about, and we've just had a glimpse.
Well, this is the onion. This is unpeeling the onion. As you learn more about different cultures, you learn more about yourself, actually.
And you learn how little you actually know. And we've also had a question about Africa that we don't have time to address. So all I can do really is thank you so much for joining us and giving us those great insights and overview of the work of Hofstede and Trompenaars and Hamden Turner. To thank everybody, of course, for joining us. And most importantly, next week, we have International Leadership Week. We've got 40 webinars from 40 countries over 4 days. And they will be running virtually on the hour, every hour, starting at very early in the morning and going on to late in the evening. There is absolutely something for everybody. We've got some fantastic speakers lined up, and we're really looking forward to getting all these insights from all around the world. And the person who asked about the coaching across cultures, join into some of those webinars and you will get such first-person insights in how to make working across culture really work. And as Raymond has said, to really begin to learn how people are different and how much we know about ourselves from looking at difference. So thank you all again, and looking forward to seeing many of you next week, I hope, at International Leadership Week.